In the quiet spaces between recorded history, there are gaps that refuse to close, moments where certainty dissolves into shadow. Ancient sites with no clear origin, vanished people who left no trace, and discoveries that defy every explanation we have. These are not just stories, but lingering questions carved into time itself. What forces shaped these unexplained events, and why do they still unsettle us centuries later? Tonight, we journey through 10 haunting historical mysteries that continue to defy logic and imagination. On the rugged island of Newfoundland, where the Atlantic wind cuts across dark fir forests and rocky coastlines, the landscape feels both ancient and unfinished. Mist rolls in from the sea and settles over rivers that carve through valleys as if they have been eroding secrets for centuries. In this place, now part of Newfoundland and Labrador, there once lived a people who understood these rhythms intimately, who read the land not as wilderness, but as home. They were the Beothuk. Their presence stretched back long before detailed records were kept, long before maps labeled these shores in European ink. The Beothuk moved seasonally between the coast and inland forests, following fish runs, caribou migrations, and the slow cycles of survival shaped by climate and tradition. They built red ochre markings onto tools, weapons, and even their skin, an identity so distinctive that early European observers would later refer to them as Red Indians, a term now recognized as both outdated and deeply misleading. But what remains most haunting is not just how they lived, it is how they disappeared. When European fishing and sealing vessels began arriving in greater numbers in the 16th and 17th centuries, the balance of the island began to shift. Shorelines that had once been freely navigated became contested spaces. The Beothuk, wary of contact and increasingly pushed inland, found themselves cut off from coastal resources that had sustained them for generations. Encounters between Beothuk and settlers were often brief, tense, and marked by misunderstanding. Trade opportunities existed, but they were inconsistent, fragile, and eventually replaced by hostility on both sides. As settlements expanded, access to salmon rivers and hunting grounds tightened. The Beothuk retreated further into the interior forests of Exploits River and surrounding watersheds, areas less visible to colonial activity, but also increasingly strained for resources. Hunger, isolation, and conflict became recurring pressures. And yet, even as their numbers declined, there were still attempts, uneasy and tragic, to make contact. One of the most well-documented encounters occurred in 1819 when a young Beothuk woman named Damastuit was captured by settlers in an effort to establish communication. She was later renamed Mary March. Her capture was not an isolated event, but part of a broader pattern of desperate, often misguided attempts to bridge two worlds that no longer understood each other. She died less than a year later, far from her homeland. These moments are recorded in colonial accounts, but they leave behind an unsettling feeling, a sense that something larger was unraveling just beyond the edges of written history. By the early 19th century, reports of Beothuk presence had become increasingly rare. Small groups were said to have been seen inland, but sightings were inconsistent, fragmented, and difficult to verify. Then, in 1829, the last widely recognized member of the Beothuk people, a woman named Shanawdithit, died in St. John's. With her passing, official history often draws a line, marking the Beothuk as extinct. But history is rarely that clean. What does it truly mean for a people to vanish? Some historical interpretations suggest that the Beothuk population did not simply disappear, but rather declined through a combination of disease, starvation, and violent conflict during a period of intense colonial expansion. European-introduced illnesses, to which indigenous populations had no immunity, likely played a devastating role. Competition over resources compounded the crisis, and shrinking territory reduced the possibility of recovery. Another widely discussed explanation is assimilation. Some researchers and oral traditions suggest that surviving Beothuk individuals may have joined neighboring indigenous groups, such as the Mi'kmaq, or integrated into settler communities, gradually losing distinct cultural visibility over generations. In this view, vanishing is not disappearance, but transformation, an absorption into other identities under pressure. Yet, even within these more grounded interpretations, gaps remain. There are accounts, uneven, unverified, but persistent, of Beothuk families retreating deeper into Newfoundland's interior than official records tracked. Stories passed down through oral traditions occasionally speak of isolated encounters long after the early 19th century, though historians treat these with caution due to lack of corroborating evidence. Still, they linger at the edges of documented history like faint echoes. And then there are more speculative ideas, the kind that often arise when certainty runs out. Some suggest that small groups may have survived in remote inland regions longer than commonly believed, adapting quietly and avoiding contact to escape violence and displacement. Others propose that fragmented Beothuk lineages may still exist within broader genealogies in Newfoundland communities today, their identity dispersed rather than extinguished. There are even more imaginative theories, rarely supported by evidence, that propose the Beothuk retreated into such isolated conditions that they effectively became invisible to colonial records for decades. These ideas remain outside mainstream historical consensus, yet they reflect a deeper human impulse, the refusal to accept total disappearance. Because disappearance, in the case of a people, is difficult to comprehend fully. It resists closure. Archaeology offers partial clarity. Excavated sites reveal tools, campsites, burial practices, and traces of seasonal movement patterns. These fragments confirm presence, continuity, and adaptation. But they cannot fully explain the final chapter. They do not tell us what was felt in those last generations, what decisions were made, what warnings were ignored, or what choices were no longer available. Perhaps that is why the story of the Beothuk continues to draw attention. It sits at the intersection of documented history and unresolved absence. It is not a single mystery, but a layered one. Environmental pressure, colonial expansion, cultural disruption, and the silence that follows when records end, but questions do not. Standing today along the rivers of Newfoundland, it is possible to imagine the world as it once was. Canoes moving quietly through inland waters. Seasonal camps tucked beneath forest cover. Smoke rising briefly before dissolving into mist. And then, gradually, fewer signs. Fewer voices. Larger spaces of quiet. What remains difficult to answer is not only how the Beothuk declined, but whether their story truly ends where official history places its final marker. If survival meant adaptation rather than continuity, where does that leave the idea of disappearance? And if traces of the Beothuk persist, genetically, culturally, or simply in memory, what does it mean to say they are gone at all? In the silence that follows these questions, the landscape offers no explanation. Only wind, water, and the lingering sense that some histories do not conclude so much as they dissolve into something we are still learning how to recognize. Continuing from the quiet uncertainty left behind in Newfoundland, where history seems to dissolve into landscape rather than conclude neatly, we shift now across the Atlantic, toward an earlier chapter of European collapse, where the boundaries between recorded fact and enduring legend grow just as thin. In the southern reaches of the Italian peninsula, where the hills of what is now Italy rise in soft layers of olive groves and stone, the land carries a different kind of silence. It is not the silence of absence, but of memory compressed over centuries. Cities built upon cities, empires folded into foundations, and roads that still follow the paths of those who walked them more than 1,000 years ago. Somewhere within that layered history stands the figure of Alaric I. To the Romans of his time, he was not merely a king, but a force of rupture, a name that marked the weakening edge of an empire that once defined the known world. He led the Visigoths during a period when borders were no longer fixed lines, but shifting thresholds, where allegiance, survival, and conquest blurred into one another. And yet, despite his impact on history, one of the most enduring questions about him is not how he lived, but where he was finally laid to rest. The story begins in the year 410 AD, when the unthinkable happened. The city of Rome was sacked. For the first time in nearly 8 centuries, the heart of the Western world was breached by an external force. Alaric's forces entered the city not as subtle infiltrators, but as conquerors of a weakened empire, already strained by internal instability, political fragmentation, and economic decline. But the sack of Rome, dramatic as it was not the end of Alaric's story. It was, in some ways, only its turning point. Soon after the event, historical accounts suggest that Alaric moved southward through the Italian peninsula. He died later that same year, in or near a settlement referred to in ancient sources as Consentia, modern-day Cosenza. And here, history begins to thin. What happened immediately after his death is not recorded with the clarity one might expect for such a significant figure. Instead, we are left with fragments, brief mentions in later writings, and oral traditions that developed into one of the most persistent legends of the late Roman world. According to one of the most widely repeated accounts, Alaric was buried in a manner unlike any other Roman or barbarian king. It is said that his followers diverted the course of a river, the Busento, so that his tomb could be constructed in the dry riverbed. He was allegedly interred with treasures taken from Rome. Then the river was returned to its course, concealing the burial site beneath flowing water. The story is striking in its imagery, a king hidden not beneath stone, but beneath motion itself. A tomb sealed not by walls, but by water. Yet, as with many accounts from this period, the question arises: how much of this is historical record, and how much is later embellishment? The earliest detailed version of this burial narrative appears in writings from centuries after Alaric's death. Roman and post-Roman chroniclers often blended historical memory with symbolic storytelling, especially when describing figures who represented the end of an era. A burial hidden beneath a river may have carried metaphorical weight, an empire's conqueror returning to the natural world in a way that no city could claim or display. And yet, the legend persists with unusual endurance. Why would such a story attach itself so firmly to Alaric's name? Some historians suggest a practical possibility, that he may have been buried discreetly to protect his remains from desecration or political exploitation. In the unstable landscape of post-Roman Italy, the body of a figure like Alaric could have held symbolic power for both allies and enemies. Concealing the burial site would have been a strategic act, preventing it from becoming a rallying point or a target. Others propose a more straightforward explanation, that he was buried in a conventional manner, but the exact location was lost due to the breakdown of administrative record-keeping during the collapse of Western Roman authority. In this view, the river story may have grown later as a poetic reconstruction of a missing fact. But there are also more speculative interpretations, often emerging from the gaps between archaeology and legend. Some propose that the Busento burial account, while exaggerated, may preserve a kernel of truth. Perhaps a river diversion was used for a temporary burial ritual, or perhaps treasure was hidden in a floodplain rather than a formal tomb. Over time, such details could have expanded into a dramatic narrative that fit the grandeur of Alaric's reputation. Others suggest that his burial site may still exist somewhere in the region, unlocated but not destroyed, lost beneath layers of sediment, urban development, or the shifting course of waterways over the centuries. Rivers, after all, do not remain fixed. The Busento itself has changed its course in places over time, complicating any attempt to match ancient descriptions with modern geography. Then there are ideas that move further into the realm of conjecture, that Alaric's burial was deliberately erased from historical memory by later Roman or Gothic successors who wished to reshape the narrative of his death, or that competing factions may have moved or concealed his remains during the chaotic years that followed his passing. None of these theories stand on firm archaeological evidence, but they persist in discussions surrounding the mystery, not because they are proven, but because the absence of certainty leaves space for them to exist. What remains particularly intriguing is how little physical evidence has been definitively tied to Alaric's final resting place. Unlike many prominent Roman figures whose tombs were monumentalized or incorporated into later structures, Alaric's burial site has never been conclusively identified. In the surrounding regions of southern Italy, archaeological work has uncovered remnants of late Roman and early medieval settlements, burial sites, and artifacts associated with Gothic presence. Yet none can be definitively linked to him. The landscape offers traces of his era, but not his endpoint. It is this absence that continues to draw attention, because in historical terms, Alaric is not forgotten. His actions are well documented, his role in the transformation of the Western Roman Empire widely acknowledged, and yet his physical resting place remains elusive, as if the final chapter of his story was written in a language we no longer fully understand. Standing near the modern course of the Busento River, one might not immediately sense the weight of history. It flows quietly through the city of Cosenza, passing beneath bridges and alongside streets where daily life continues largely unaware of the legend beneath it. And yet, somewhere within that layered ground, stone, silt, and centuries of change, the question persists. Was a river truly diverted to conceal a king? Or did that story emerge later, shaped by memory and meaning rather than direct observation? Even more fundamentally, does it matter whether the legend is literal or symbolic if it continues to shape how history is understood? The mystery endures not because it resists all explanation, but because it exists at the boundary between explanation and imagination, between what was recorded and what was remembered, between what was buried intentionally and what was lost unintentionally. And so, as the river continues its slow, uninterrupted course through southern Italy, the question remains suspended beneath its surface, not only where Alaric I was laid to rest, but how many other endings from this era have been carried away in the same current, leaving only stories behind. There is a particular kind of silence that follows the end of a voyage that never returns, an absence not just of voices, but of certainty itself. In the previous stories, we traced the outlines of vanished ships and uncertain shores, where maps ended and speculation began. Yet even among those maritime disappearances, few feel as methodically recorded and as hauntingly incomplete as the case of the brothers Gaspar and Miguel Corte-Real. To understand their disappearance, one must first imagine the edge of the known world as it existed at the turn of the 16th century. The North Atlantic is not yet a blank space on European maps, but it is close. It is a shifting expanse of inked guesses, annotated coastlines, and warnings passed between sailors like whispered cautionary tales. Cold currents move south from the Arctic, carrying ice, fog, and debris from distant shores no European had yet named. Storm systems rise without warning, swallowing ships whole and erasing all distinction between horizon and water. Somewhere into that uncertain vastness, two expeditions set sail under the authority of Portugal, led by members of the Corte-Real family, Gaspar first, followed later by his brother Miguel. Their names would become bound not to discovery, but to absence. Gaspar Corte-Real is often remembered as the younger of the two brothers to embark on Atlantic exploration. In the year 1500, he set out with the intention of finding a northwest passage or lands that could be claimed for the Portuguese crown. The motivations were typical of the age of exploration: trade routes, prestige, and the promise of wealth that might lie just beyond the reach of mapped certainty. He returned from one of his early voyages with reports of a cold, rugged coastline, likely parts of what is now understood to be Newfoundland and Labrador. He described forested shores and indigenous peoples encountered along the way, bringing back captives in a practice that, while common in that era, leaves a darker imprint on modern interpretation of his expeditions. Encouraged by what he had seen, Gaspar departed again in 1501 with multiple ships. And then, he simply did not return. No wreckage was definitively identified. No survivors arrived months or years later with a coherent account. The sea, vast and indifferent, offered no clear answer. Only absence remained. In the wake of Gaspar's disappearance, his brother Miguel Corte-Real took up the search in 1502. Miguel petitioned the Portuguese crown for permission to seek out his brother and continue exploration of the same northern waters. He received authorization and set sail with a fleet of ships, driven by a motivation that was no longer purely exploratory. This was no longer a journey toward discovery. It had become a journey into uncertainty, perhaps even desperation. Miguel's expedition followed the same general Atlantic routes as Gaspar's, likely reaching the same cold coastal regions where fog rolls in thick enough to erase ships from view even at close distance. Historical records suggest that Miguel may have reached the same or nearby shores of North America, but like his brother, he vanished without definitive trace. What makes the Corte-Real disappearances particularly unsettling is not only the lack of return, but the partial nature of the record itself. Unlike other lost expeditions of the era, where documentation is sparse or entirely absent, the Corte-Real voyages exist in a strange middle ground, well enough recorded to confirm intent and departure, yet too incomplete to explain conclusion. So what happened in those northern waters? One of the most widely accepted explanations is also the simplest: maritime disaster. The North Atlantic is unforgiving, particularly for early 16th century vessels built of wood, canvas, and ambition. Icebergs drift silently even in summer months. Storms can last for days. Navigation tools, while advanced for their time, were still crude by modern standards. A miscalculation of latitude, a sudden shift in wind, or an unseen reef could easily end an expedition without trace. In this interpretation, the Corte-Real ships may have been crushed by ice, broken apart in storms, or lost to sinking without survivors capable of sending word back to Europe. The ocean, in this view, is not mysterious. It is simply vast and often merciless. Yet historical mysteries rarely remain contained within their most practical explanation. Some accounts, though fragmentary and debated, suggest contact between European explorers and indigenous peoples of North America during this period. Gaspar Corte-Real himself is believed to have taken several indigenous individuals captive and returned them to Portugal. One interpretation of later testimony implies that Miguel may have sought out similar encounters during his search for his brother, perhaps even hoping for guidance or intelligence about Gaspar's fate. This opens another possibility, that at least some members of the expeditions survived longer than assumed, integrating briefly or interacting with coastal communities before disappearing from European record. Oral histories in various Atlantic regions have, at times, been loosely connected, often speculatively and without consensus, to early European arrivals predating widespread colonization. However, no definitive archaeological evidence has ever confirmed a surviving trail of either Corte-Real expedition inland or along coastal settlements. The silence remains intact. Then there are the more speculative theories, which emerge whenever gaps in history align too neatly with imagination. Some suggest that the ships may have been deliberately attacked, either by unknown rival European interests operating covertly in the Atlantic, or by defensive actions from indigenous groups responding to prior hostile encounters. While there is little direct evidence for such a confrontation involving the Corte-Reals specifically, the early 1500s were a period of increasing maritime competition, and records from that time are far from complete. Other theories drift further from the documented world into the realm of environmental misfortune, compounded by navigational misunderstanding. The idea of the fog-bound coast has been repeatedly emphasized in maritime histories of the North Atlantic. In such conditions, entire fleets could become disoriented, sailing in circles or grounding themselves on unseen shores. Some historians have suggested that the Corte-Real ships may have reached land, become trapped in ice-bound harbors, and slowly succumbed to exposure, starvation, or scurvy, leaving little archaeological footprint behind. And yet, even these explanations, while plausible, do not fully resolve the unsettling quality of the story. There is something about the coordinated disappearance of both brothers, each leading separate expeditions within a short span of time, that resists easy closure. It creates a pattern that feels almost intentional in its silence. Could it be coincidence alone? 2 expeditions, 2 sets of ships, 2 losses to the same vast ocean, separated by only a year or so, both erased without trace? Or does the Atlantic itself hold something more complex in its memory, something not yet fully reconstructed from the fragments of logs, letters, and second-hand accounts that survive? There is also the matter of political and historical silence. The Portuguese crown, deeply invested in other expanding maritime routes during this period, did not continue sustained search efforts for the Corte-Real brothers. Attention shifted toward more successful or strategically valuable voyages. In the absence of survivors and without recoverable cargo or navigational data, the expeditions gradually became historical footnotes rather than central narratives of exploration. But footnotes, too, can carry weight, especially when they point toward empty spaces on maps that were once filled with hope. Modern historians occasionally revisit the Corte-Real voyages through the lens of archaeology and oceanography, attempting to reconstruct likely routes based on prevailing winds and currents. Some models suggest probable paths toward Greenland or the coasts of Newfoundland. Others propose that ships caught in Labrador currents could have been pulled into regions of dense ice, where wreckage would be unlikely to surface or survive centuries of shifting sea pressure. Still, no confirmed wreck site has ever been attributed to either expedition. The sea has not returned what it took. Perhaps what makes the Corte-Real mystery endure is not just the disappearance itself, but the human expectation embedded within it, the assumption that exploration, even when dangerous, produces answers. In this case, it did not. Instead, it produced silence that has lasted for more than 5 centuries. And so the imagination continues to fill the gaps, not to resolve them, but to inhabit them. One might picture Gaspar's ships pushing into gray horizons, sails heavy with damp wind, crew members scanning the water for signs of land that never quite materializes. Or Miguel, years later, following the same uncertain routes, perhaps studying old charts marked with fading ink, hoping to trace the logic of his brother's final movements. At some point along those routes, the distinction between search and loss may have dissolved entirely. What does it mean to search for someone in a place where even direction becomes uncertain? And how does a crew continue forward when every wave feels indistinguishable from the last, and every horizon looks like the one before it? The Corte-Real expeditions leave these questions suspended, unresolved by the passage of time. One way to extend the Corte-Real mystery is to move from the idea of individual disappearance into the broader structural reality of early Atlantic navigation, where even known routes, were less like fixed corridors and more like shifting probabilities shaped by wind, ice, and incomplete understanding. In the early 16th century, ships moving through the North Atlantic, especially those operating under the authority of the Portuguese crown, were dependent on seasonal timing and highly variable oceanic conditions that could fundamentally alter both trajectory and outcome. Within that system, the voyages of Gaspar and Miguel Corte-Real can also be read through the limitations of navigation itself. Latitude estimation was possible with increasing accuracy, but longitude remained effectively unresolved. This meant that even when a ship believed it was following a known northern corridor, small cumulative errors could place it far from its intended path. In the vast, low-reference environment of the Atlantic, such deviations were not easily detectable until land failed to appear, or appeared in entirely unexpected form. This navigational uncertainty becomes especially significant when considering the possibility of ice-bound drift systems extending toward regions associated with early sightings of what is now Newfoundland. Ocean currents such as the Labrador Current could carry damaged or disabled vessels into dense ice fields where movement became constrained. Visibility collapsed into fog and snow, and survival depended on conditions that early modern maritime technology was not equipped to manage for long durations. At the same time, the archival structure surrounding these expeditions reflects a different kind of limitation. Records of departure are relatively clear, preserved through royal authorization and port documentation, but records of return, or failure, depend heavily on secondary reporting. In the absence of survivors, administrative systems defaulted to silence, not because information was deliberately removed, but because there was no mechanism to complete the narrative cycle. This creates a particular historical asymmetry. Exploration voyages are well documented at their inception and poorly documented at their conclusion. The Corte-Real expeditions sit precisely within this gap, where intent is visible but termination is not. In such cases, the historical record preserves motion without resolution, producing a structural sense of incompleteness that can persist for centuries. There is also the question of contact density along the North Atlantic frontier. Unlike later colonial zones with sustained settlement, the early 1500s Atlantic edge was sparsely networked. Even if survivors had reached shore, the likelihood of encountering other European groups capable of transmitting news back to Europe was extremely low. Isolation, in this sense, was not just geographic but communicative, effectively severing any potential feedback loop between event and record. Within indigenous coastal regions of northeastern North America, oral transmission systems existed that were capable of preserving complex environmental and social knowledge. But these systems do not necessarily map onto European archival expectations. As a result, any encounters, peaceful or hostile, would have been filtered through incompatible systems of memory, making later reconstruction inherently fragmentary. This is where the Corte-Real narrative begins to resemble a wider pattern in early maritime history. Expeditions that vanish not into mystery, but into structural non-recoverability. The combination of ice, distance, limited communication infrastructure, and episodic record-keeping creates conditions where disappearance is not exceptional, but statistically plausible. Even environmental modeling of the North Atlantic reinforces this ambiguity. Seasonal ice expansion, sudden storm formation, and long-duration fog systems create zones where visual navigation becomes unreliable for extended periods. In such conditions, a ship does not need to encounter a singular catastrophic event to be effectively erased from history. Gradual immobilization, resource depletion, or disorientation can achieve the same archival outcome. Yet what continues to distinguish the Corte-Real case is not only the disappearance itself, but its doubling. 2 brothers, 2 expeditions, 2 absences occurring within a short temporal span. This repetition introduces interpretive pressure, not necessarily suggesting causation, but highlighting how pattern recognition operates within historical storytelling. Human memory tends to treat repetition as meaningful even when underlying causes remain independent. The North Atlantic does not give up its stories easily. After the silence surrounding Gaspar and Miguel Corte-Real, after the unanswered questions left drifting in the cold waters of their final voyage, the historical record does something curious. It shifts. It softens. The certainty of ships and dates begins to blur into something more unstable, something that looks less like documented exploration and more like memory reshaped by distance. And somewhere along that blurred edge between cartography and imagination, another name begins to appear. Not a ship, not a person, but a place that may or may not have existed in the way it was described. Norumbega. To follow its trace is to move away from open ocean and into a different kind of uncertainty, one that rests not in the drowning of ships, but in the fading of cities that were never fully confirmed to exist at all. Imagine a river estuary on the northeastern edge of what is now understood as North America. Wide waters slow as they approach the sea, carrying with them forest debris, shifting sediments, and the quiet pressure of tides that seem to hesitate before meeting the Atlantic. The air is damp, thick with the scent of pine and salt. Fog rises in long, low sheets, obscuring the shoreline so completely that land and water become indistinguishable. This is where early European maps begin to place Norumbega, not as a single point, not as a simple settlement, but as something larger, sometimes a city, sometimes a region, sometimes an entire civilization suggested by cartographic imagination rather than verified observation. In the 16th century, as explorers moved along the coasts of what is now the northeastern region of the continent, reports began to circulate in Europe of wealthy inland settlements. Some accounts describe fortified towns. Others speak of rivers lined with prosperous communities engaged in trade. The details shift depending on the source, the language, and perhaps the expectations of the listener. One of the most influential early references comes from European navigators and geographers attempting to map the unknown coastlines beyond Greenland and the Atlantic approaches. Among them, French explorers charting parts of northeastern North America contributed to a growing belief that somewhere inland, beyond the immediate coastline, there existed a wealthy settlement system associated with the region later labeled Norumbega. On early maps, the name begins to appear along river systems that resemble the modern-day area of the Penobscot River. The placement is not consistent. It drifts from map to map, sometimes closer to the coast, sometimes deep inland, as if cartographers themselves are unsure whether they are recording a real place or reconstructing second-hand fragments of rumor. And yet, the name persists. Norumbega. What makes it so compelling is not just its presence on maps, but the way it changes shape over time. In some depictions, it is a modest trading settlement. In others, it becomes a fortified city of stone and wealth, described in terms that feel more aligned with European urban centers than with what was then known of indigenous settlements in the region. How did such a transformation occur? And what exactly were early explorers reporting when they spoke of inland riches and complex societies beyond the coastline? One possibility lies in translation, both linguistic and cultural. Early encounters between European explorers and indigenous peoples of the region were often mediated through gestures, fragmented interpretation, and assumptions shaped by entirely different worldviews. A description of multiple villages connected by trade routes could, in European retellings, evolve into the idea of a single great city. A reference to seasonal gathering places might be reinterpreted as permanent urban centers. Over time, these interpretations layered upon one another until Norumbega became less a specific location and more a conceptual space, a placeholder for wealth and civilization believed to exist just beyond verified knowledge. But there is another layer to the mystery, one that deepens when considering how often Norumbega appears in association with rivers and inland waterways. Explorers of the period, moving cautiously along unfamiliar coasts, often relied on river systems as natural entry points into the continent. These waterways offered access, but also confusion. Tides could carry ships far inland before reversing. Mist could erase the horizon entirely. A river that seemed navigable in one season might become impassable in another. In such conditions, how accurately could early explorers distinguish between extended settlements and transient camps, between large villages and interconnected networks of smaller communities? And how easily might those distinctions have been lost in translation once reports returned to Europe? Yet Norumbega does not remain confined to ambiguity alone. In some accounts, it is described with surprising specificity. One notable narrative from the late 16th century describes a wealthy inland settlement accessible by river, where European visitors were received with hospitality and shown goods of apparent value. These descriptions, though inconsistent in detail, contributed to the growing belief that Norumbega was not merely a myth, but a mislocated or misunderstood reality. The tension here is subtle but important. Norumbega was not initially dismissed as fantasy. It was treated, for a time, as a geographical problem waiting to be solved. Where exactly was it? Why could it not be found again? And why did every attempt to locate it seem to lead only deeper into uncertainty? As cartographic traditions evolved, Norumbega began to shift in representation. On some maps, it appears as a prominent city along the northeastern waterways. On others, it fades into a vague regional label. Eventually, it begins to disappear from official cartography altogether, replaced by more precise coastal mapping as European knowledge of North America expanded. But disappearance from maps does not always mean disappearance from imagination. Even as Norumbega was gradually removed from serious geographic consideration, it persisted in literature, travel accounts, and speculative histories. Writers and historians continued to revisit the idea, sometimes suggesting that the original reports had been exaggerated, sometimes arguing that a real settlement had once existed but was abandoned or transformed before sustained European contact. One recurring interpretation proposes that Norumbega was never a single city at all, but rather a misunderstanding of indigenous settlement patterns along river systems like the Penobscot River. Seasonal migration, trade networks, and temporary gathering sites could easily appear, from a distance or under brief observation, as a more continuous urbanized structure. But even this explanation does not fully erase the lingering questions. Because some early descriptions do not merely suggest settlements, they suggest architecture, permanence, and scale that remain difficult to reconcile with later ethnographic records. Was this exaggeration born from misunderstanding? Or from the European tendency of the era to interpret the unfamiliar through familiar frameworks? There are also more speculative interpretations, often arising from the gaps between maps and memory. Some propose that Norumbega represents a lost or abandoned indigenous center that has yet to be archaeologically identified, its remnants obscured by centuries of environmental change, sedimentation, or shifting river courses. Others suggest something even more elusive, that Norumbega was a composite of multiple places, blended together by repeated retellings until it became a single imagined destination. In this view, explorers were not describing one settlement, but many, each partially observed, each imperfectly recorded, and all eventually fused into a singular name on European maps. And then there are interpretations that move further into the margins of historical speculation, where Norumbega becomes not a misidentified place, but a symbol of something else entirely, the projection of expectation onto unknown land. In this reading, Norumbega represents what early explorers hoped to find: wealth, order, and civilization beyond the Atlantic, rather than what was actually there. A mirage shaped not by sand or heat, but by anticipation and incomplete understanding. Still, even this symbolic interpretation does not fully resolve the mystery, because symbols, once created, tend to persist. And Norumbega persisted for centuries longer than many similarly uncertain place names of its era. Why did this particular name endure when so many others faded? What gave it such resilience in the imagination of mapmakers, explorers, and historians alike? Part of the answer may lie in the geography itself. The northeastern waterways of North America, including the Penobscot River, are complex systems of branching channels, islands, and tidal variations. To early navigators, unfamiliar with these patterns, the landscape could easily suggest hidden infrastructure, routes that seemed too structured to be entirely natural, or clusters of settlements that appeared and disappeared with the tides. In such an environment, certainty becomes fragile. A shoreline seen at dusk may not match the same shoreline seen at dawn. A settlement observed from offshore may vanish behind fog before it can be approached. Even distance itself becomes unreliable. And so the question returns, not as a demand for an answer, but as a recognition of uncertainty itself. At what point does repeated misinterpretation become its own kind of geography? One way to extend the problem of Norumbega is to move from the coastline itself into the mechanics of how early modern geography was assembled inside European centers such as Paris. By the time reports from the North Atlantic reached such hubs, they were already several interpretive steps removed from the landscapes they attempted to describe. Navigators' logs, merchants' recollections, and indigenous exchanges filtered through translation, then through summarization, and finally through cartographic synthesis. In that process, institutions like the early modern French maritime administration under the broader framework of the French crown played a decisive role in stabilizing uncertainty. Maps were not merely records of observation. They were instruments of authority, designed to convert inconsistent coastal impressions into coherent spatial order. A name like Norumbega could therefore persist not because it was consistently verified, but because it repeatedly functioned as a useful placeholder within an expanding geographic system. This helps explain why river systems, such as those leading into the region now associated with the northeastern United States, became so central to the mythic geography. In early exploration narratives, waterways like the Penobscot River were not simply physical features, but epistemic pathways, routes through which unknown interiors could be mentally constructed long before they were physically understood. Each expedition that followed such a river carried not only tools of navigation, but also the accumulated expectations of previous accounts. Within this layered process, Norumbega can be read as a product of cartographic convergence rather than a single observational origin. Multiple indigenous settlement patterns, seasonal villages, trade junctions, and inland gathering points may have been perceived through European interpretive frameworks that favored permanence, centralization, and monumentality. What was in reality distributed and seasonal could therefore be reassembled in reports and maps. The coastline of Greenland is not a single line, but a fractured boundary between worlds. Ice presses outward from the interior in slow, grinding motion, breaking into cliffs of pale blue and white that collapse into the sea with a sound like distant thunder. Fjords cut deep into the land, their waters dark and still, reflecting a sky that often feels closer than the ground beneath it. In some places, rock emerges from the ice only briefly in the short Arctic summer, as if the land itself is reluctant to remain visible for long. It is here, in this shifting edge of endurance and silence, that one of medieval history's most fragile institutions once took root: the Greenland Bishopric. Established in the early 12th century, under the authority of the Norse Christian world, the Bishopric of Greenland was centered in a settlement known as Gardar. It was not a city in the modern sense, but a small ecclesiastical hub surrounded by scattered farms and Norse communities spread across the fjords. From this remote outpost, bishops oversaw religious life in one of the most isolated corners of the medieval North Atlantic world. At its height, the bishopric represented something extraordinary, a formal continuation of European ecclesiastical structure in a land of ice, distance, and seasonal isolation. Stone churches were built. Agricultural settlements persisted in narrow valleys where conditions allowed. And for a time, communication with Norway and Iceland maintained a fragile thread of continuity. But history in this region is rarely stable. It is layered like the ice itself, compressed, fractured, and difficult to read in full. The mystery begins not with the founding of the bishopric, but with its fading record. Because while the physical remnants of Norse Greenland have been studied extensively, ruins of churches, farms, and settlements preserved in frozen soil, there is a far more elusive question that lingers at the edges of historical certainty. What happened to the written archives of the Greenland Bishopric? These were not casual documents. They would have included correspondence with ecclesiastical authorities in Europe, records of tithes, land ownership, baptisms, marriages, deaths, and the administrative life of a distant Christian outpost. In theory, such records should have left traces in European repositories, particularly in Norway, where Greenland's ecclesiastical oversight was formally connected. And yet, the surviving archival footprint is strikingly thin. There are references to documents, mentions of letters sent, indirect citations in later records. But the core archive, the sustained, continuous written record of the bishopric in Greenland itself, has not survived in any complete form. Why? One of the most widely accepted explanations is environmental and logistical fragility. Greenland is not a place where paper survives easily without deliberate preservation. Moisture, cold cycles, and the sheer difficulty of maintaining consistent storage conditions in medieval settlements would have made long-term archival preservation extremely challenging. Fires in wooden structures, relocation of ecclesiastical centers, and the eventual decline of Norse settlements could all have contributed to the gradual disappearance of records. There is also the broader historical context of Norse Greenland's decline. By the 15th century, European contact with the settlements had largely ceased. The reasons remain complex and still debated. Climate shifts associated with the Little Ice Age, changing trade routes, resource limitations, and possible social or economic isolation. As communication diminished, so too would the transmission of documents to European centers. In this view, the archives were not lost in a single dramatic event. They simply dissolved into discontinuity, scattered, destroyed, or left behind as the society that produced them slowly disappeared. But the absence still feels disproportionate, because even fragmented medieval institutions tend to leave behind more documentary residue than what survives from Greenland. This imbalance has led some historians to consider alternative possibilities, not necessarily as definitive answers, but as ways of accounting for what seems incomplete. One such possibility is that parts of the archive did survive, but were absorbed into larger ecclesiastical collections in Europe without clear labeling of origin. Medieval manuscript transmission was not always systematic. Documents were recopied, summarized, or integrated into compilations where geographic origin could become secondary to content. If Greenlandic records were preserved in this way, they may now exist embedded within broader Norse or Norwegian ecclesiastical archives, indistinguishable without extremely detailed provenance analysis. In this interpretation, the archive is not lost, it is dispersed. But there remains another layer of uncertainty tied to the physical reality of Greenland itself. The ruins of the Bishopric Center at Gardar have yielded archaeological evidence of ecclesiastical life, foundations of churches, residential structures, and agricultural activity. Yet written material is almost entirely absent from excavation sites. Organic materials degrade quickly in many Greenlandic soil conditions unless preserved in ice or exceptionally dry environments. If archives were stored in wooden buildings, leather-bound volumes, or parchment collections, their survival would depend on highly specific conditions that may not have been met. Still, the near-total absence of recovered written material continues to raise questions. Where exactly were these documents kept? Were they centralized in the bishop's residence or distributed across multiple sites? And what happened during the final decades of Norse presence in Greenland, when contact with Europe became increasingly rare? As the historical record moves closer to the bishopric's final centuries, it becomes quieter, less detailed. European sources begin to speak of Greenland in increasingly distant terms, not as a functioning ecclesiastical territory, but as a fading memory of earlier expansion. By the time of the last known bishops, communication had become sporadic, and eventually it ceased altogether. After that point, the silence deepens. Yet silence, in historical terms, is rarely absolute. It often contains echoes. Some speculative interpretations suggest that the disappearance of the archives may be tied not only to environmental decay, but to intentional consolidation. In times of hardship, communities prioritize survival over record-keeping. Churches may have been abandoned or repurposed. Valuable manuscripts, if still intact, could have been transported, selectively preserved, or even destroyed to protect sensitive information. There is also the possibility, less supported but occasionally discussed, that some records may have been removed during periods of transition and never properly reintroduced into European archival systems. In such a scenario, documents could exist, uncatalogued or misattributed, within collections that no longer clearly identify their Greenlandic origin. This raises an intriguing question. How many medieval documents are effectively lost, not because they were destroyed, but because their identity was gradually erased through centuries of copying, translation, and archival restructuring? And then there are the more speculative fringes of interpretation, which suggest that the Greenland bishopric may have preserved certain knowledge or records separately, perhaps in response to increasing isolation. In such a view, the archives might have been deliberately hidden, relocated, or protected during the final collapse of the Norse settlements. These ideas remain unverified, but they emerge from a persistent historical tension, the gap between what should have been preserved and what is actually found. Even within the archaeological imagination, Greenland holds a particular kind of stillness. Ice preserves more than it reveals. It can seal objects away for centuries, only to release them in fragments under shifting conditions. Could written material lie preserved in locations yet unexplored or inaccessible beneath ice layers or collapsed structures? Or has time already passed too far beyond the point of recovery? The bishopric itself at Gardar stands today as ruins integrated into a quiet landscape, where grass grows over stone foundations and fjords continue their slow movement toward the sea. It is not a place of visible mystery in the conventional sense. There are no dramatic ruins towering above the land, no inscriptions left intact to suggest hidden archives waiting beneath. And yet, the absence of records creates its own form of presence. A gap where continuity should be. A silence where administrative life once existed in detail. What makes this particularly compelling is that medieval ecclesiastical institutions were, by their nature, record-generating systems. The disappearance of such documentation from any functioning bishopric would normally be anomalous. In Greenland, it becomes the norm. So the question is not only what happened to the archives, but what their absence tells us about the final phase of Norse Greenland itself. Was it a gradual unraveling, where record-keeping simply ceased as conditions deteriorated? Was it a dispersal, where documents were carried away in fragmented form and absorbed elsewhere? Or is there still, somewhere within Greenland's layered ice and sediment, a physical trace of written history waiting in conditions that have not yet been fully examined? One way to extend this question is to shift attention from the idea of a single lost archive to the structural fragility of ecclesiastical administration at the farthest edge of the North Atlantic world, where even the concept of centralized record-keeping had to adapt to extreme isolation. In the case of the Greenland bishopric centered at Gardar, documentation would not have existed as a single stable collection, but as a dispersed network of writings moving between farms, churches, and seasonal points of contact. This dispersion becomes especially significant when considering the relationship between Greenland and the wider Norse ecclesiastical world, particularly in Norway, where episcopal oversight was formally anchored. In theory, copies of correspondence, tithe records, and ecclesiastical reports should have been transmitted back to European centers. In practice, however, each transfer depended on infrequent voyages across highly unstable sea routes, where weather, timing, and political disruption could easily interrupt continuity. The broader institutional context of the medieval church also matters here. The Greenland bishopric functioned within the authority of the Catholic ecclesiastical system, where record preservation was never purely archival in the modern sense, but tied to immediate administrative utility. Documents were created to solve problems, confirm land rights, authorize tithes, record sacraments, and once their functional role diminished, they were far less likely to be carefully preserved, especially in marginal regions. At the same time, environmental conditions in Norse Greenland introduced a level of unpredictability that European scriptoria rarely faced. Even in relatively stable settlements, parchment and ink required controlled conditions that were difficult to maintain over long winters and shifting habitation patterns. Buildings could be abandoned, reused, or structurally altered as communities adapted to changing resources, meaning that storage continuity was never guaranteed across generations. Archaeological studies of Norse Greenland settlements, including ecclesiastical sites, suggest a pattern of gradual contraction rather than abrupt collapse. As communities became smaller and more isolated, administrative practices likely narrowed as well. Record production may have continued in reduced form for some time, but without sustained external contact, the incentive to preserve or transmit extensive documentation would have steadily declined. This helps explain why the surviving archival footprint appears not simply incomplete, but asymmetrically thin compared to the physical archaeological record. The ruins of churches, farms, and burial sites remain materially legible, while the written dimension of those same communities is disproportionately absent. The imbalance suggests not a single catastrophic loss, but a long period in which writing gradually ceased to circulate beyond local memory. In this context, the final centuries of Norse presence in Greenland can be understood as a transition from documented administration to largely undocumented persistence. As contact with European ecclesiastical centers weakened, especially those tied to Norwegian oversight, the bishopric's written output may have become increasingly local, episodic, and ultimately non-transmissible. There is also the possibility of archival absorption without recognition. Medieval ecclesiastical systems often incorporated incoming materials into larger collections without preserving detailed provenance. If Greenlandic documents reached European repositories, they may have been merged into broader Scandinavian or church compilations, their geographic origin effectively erased in the process of copying and reorganization. Even the physical geography of Greenland itself contributes to the uncertainty. Sites like Igaliku sit within landscapes shaped by glacial movement, seasonal freeze-thaw cycles, and shifting soil conditions. These processes are not conducive to long-term preservation of organic writing materials unless exceptional circumstances occur, such as burial in ice or extreme dryness. Still, the absence of recovered manuscripts raises a deeper interpretive question: whether the disappearance of the archive reflects the disappearance of the institutional conditions that produced it. In other words, the loss of records may be less an event than a symptom of administrative dissolution itself, where writing ceases not because it is destroyed, but because the system that sustained it gradually stops functioning. From this perspective, the Greenland Bishopric becomes a case study in archival dependency. Records do not exist independently of the institutions that maintain them. When those institutions contract, fragment, or lose external connection, documentation does not simply become vulnerable, it becomes structurally unsustainable. And so the question shifts again, away from the search for. After the silence of Greenland's icebound bishopric, after the fading ink of archives that may or may not still exist in forgotten repositories, the narrative turns once again toward the western edges of medieval memory, toward a land where political history itself feels fragmented, written in conquest, reversal, and abrupt endings. There are certain deaths in history that do not settle cleanly into chronology. They resist the clarity of cause and effect. They linger instead as transitional moments, where a ruler's final breath becomes inseparable from the fate of an entire kingdom. Such is the case with Edmund Ironside. To approach his story, one must first imagine early 11th century England, not yet a unified nation in the modern sense, but a fractured landscape of contested rule. Forests still cover large stretches of land between fortified towns. Rivers serve as both barriers and highways, and authority shifts as quickly as the tides along the coast. At the center of this instability stands Edmund II of England, later known as Edmund Ironside. His epithet evokes strength, resilience, and the sense of a ruler forged in continuous warfare. And indeed, much of his brief reign is defined by conflict with the invading forces of Canute the Great, whose campaigns across England would reshape the political structure of the region. By the year 1016 AD, Edmund had become king under circumstances already marked by urgency and fragmentation. His predecessor, Ethelred the Unready, had left a kingdom weakened by repeated invasions and internal division. Edmund's rise was not the beginning of stability, but an attempt to restore it under conditions already deeply unsettled. Battles followed in rapid succession. The English countryside became a shifting theater of engagement. London, Mercia, and Wessex all becoming stages in a war that neither side could fully resolve in a single decisive moment. Eventually, after a series of confrontations that ended without absolute victory for either party, Edmund and Canute reached a political settlement that divided authority between them. But that fragile equilibrium would not last long, because within the same year, Edmund Ironside died, and the nature of his death has remained a subject of quiet historical uncertainty ever since. The most widely accepted account places his death on November 30th, 1016 AD, shortly after the agreement with Canute. Some chronicles suggest he died in London. Others imply he may have been elsewhere in England at the time. What remains consistent is the suddenness of the event. A king who had survived repeated battles, negotiated fragile peace, and withstood sustained invasion, died unexpectedly within weeks of a political compromise. The cause, in some early accounts, is described simply as illness. No elaborate detail, no extended description of suffering. Just a transition from life to death that occurs with minimal narrative explanation. And it is here that the historical record begins to thin. Because in an era where royal deaths were often carefully recorded, interpreted, and sometimes even mythologized, Edmund's passing is notably restrained in detail. Later chroniclers, writing under the influence of shifting political landscapes, offer limited expansion on the circumstances. There is no universally agreed description of symptoms, no consistent timeline of decline, no medical explanation beyond the general category of sudden illness. So, what exactly happened in those final days? One interpretation, grounded in the realities of the time, suggests natural causes. Warfare in the early medieval period placed enormous strain on the human body. Exposure, exhaustion, infection, and untreated wounds were constant risks. It is entirely plausible that Edmund, after years of campaigning, succumbed to an undiagnosed condition, perhaps intestinal illness, infection, or complications from earlier injuries sustained in battle. In this view, his death is not mysterious, but simply unrecorded in medical detail due to the limitations of the era. Yet even within this straightforward explanation, something remains unsettled: the timing. Edmund's death occurs so closely after the political division of the kingdom that it alters the balance of power almost immediately. With his passing, Cnut becomes uncontested ruler of England. A negotiated partition collapses into singular authority. Was this merely coincidence? Or does the proximity of political resolution and royal death create a narrative tension that later generations found difficult to ignore? Some medieval chroniclers, writing years or even decades later, begin to frame Edmund's death in more interpretive language, not necessarily accusing foul play directly, but allowing space for ambiguity. In a world where royal courts were deeply entangled in shifting alliances, the possibility of poisoning or covert removal of rivals was never entirely outside historical imagination. Cnut himself, however, is not consistently portrayed as a conspirator in Edmund's death in the most reliable early sources. In fact, some accounts suggest a degree of respect between the two rulers, even acknowledging Edmund's strength as an adversary. This complicates any simplistic narrative of assassination or deliberate removal. And yet, the absence of detailed medical explanation leaves room for speculation. What does it mean when a king dies at the precise moment when his survival would have most significantly altered the political structure of a region? Could illness alone account for such timing? Or does the uncertainty reflect something more mundane? The limitations of record-keeping in a period where even royal deaths were not always documented with precision. There is also the matter of location. While London is often cited as the place of Edmund's death, some variation in medieval sources leaves this detail less firmly anchored than one might expect. Travel between royal sites, military encampments, and administrative centers was common. The king's presence was not fixed in a single capital in the modern sense. He moved where authority was needed, where armies assembled, where negotiations unfolded. This mobility complicates attempts to reconstruct his final days with certainty. Was he already weakened before reaching London? Did his condition deteriorate rapidly during travel? Or did his death occur in a context that was never fully recorded because attention immediately shifted toward succession and political consolidation? Following his death, Edmund was buried at Glastonbury Abbey, a site already associated with royal and spiritual significance. Yet even burial traditions of the period, while solemn and structured, do not provide additional clarity regarding cause of death. The rituals of interment preserve memory of status, not necessarily of medical truth. And so the physical record ends where the historical uncertainty begins. Over time, Edmund Ironside's death became part of a broader narrative of transition, the final collapse of Anglo-Saxon resistance to Danish rule and the beginning of a new political era under Canut's reign. In this larger framework, the details of his passing were gradually overshadowed by the consequences that followed. But history rarely lets such moments remain fully closed. Later interpretations occasionally revisit the idea that Edmund's death, occurring so soon after political compromise, may have been more complex than early summaries suggest. Not necessarily in the sense of conspiracy, but in the sense of incomplete understanding. A death recorded at a moment when record-keeping itself was secondary to survival and governance. What information was lost in the urgency of succession? What observations were never written down because they were not considered essential at the time? And how much of what we now interpret as mystery is simply the natural gap between lived experience and preserved documentation? There is also a psychological dimension to Edmund's story that cannot be ignored. He was a ruler defined by resistance, by repeated confrontation with external invasion, and by an ability to endure prolonged military pressure. His epithet, Ironside, reflects not only martial capability, but also symbolic resilience. A sudden death under such a figure creates narrative dissonance. It interrupts the expected trajectory of endurance. It replaces continuity with abrupt absence. And it is often in such disruptions that historical imagination begins to expand beyond the limits of recorded fact. Was his death truly sudden, or was it the culmination of unseen decline? Was illness the full explanation, or merely the most accessible one for chroniclers working with incomplete information? And why does this particular moment in early English history continue to attract interpretive uncertainty, even when broader political outcomes are well understood? Perhaps because Edmund Ironside's death does not exist in isolation. It sits at a turning point where one era dissolves into another, where resistance becomes consolidation, where fragmented rule becomes centralized authority. In such transitions, individuals often become less visible than the structures that replace them. And yet, it is precisely in those moments of reduced visibility that questions persist most strongly. One way to extend this uncertainty is to place Edmund Ironside's final days within the broader mechanics of early medieval record-making in the Kingdom of England, where even royal events were not recorded as continuous narratives, but as selective entries shaped by political necessity. Chronicle writing in this period was often retrospective, compiled in monastic environments where memory, local perspective, and later political context all influenced what was preserved and what was left unrecorded. Within that framework, the reign of Edmund Ironside sits at an especially unstable documentary junction. His death is not recorded through a unified administrative apparatus, but through later chroniclers who were themselves writing under the evolving legitimacy of the succeeding regime. This introduces a structural bias. Events that led to clear political outcomes were preserved, while the granular details of transitional moments were often compressed or omitted. The transition to the rule of Canute the Great further complicates the preservation of detail. Regime change in the early 11th century was not only political, but also archival. New rulers inherited systems of record-keeping that were incomplete, regionally inconsistent, and often filtered through institutions that had already begun to reinterpret the previous reign. In such contexts, the documentation of a predecessor's final illness would not necessarily be a priority compared to securing legitimacy and administrative continuity. Another factor lies in the nature of monastic chronicle production itself. Many of the surviving accounts of Edmund's death were written in ecclesiastical settings where authors were more concerned with moral interpretation than medical specificity. Deaths of kings were frequently framed within theological or providential language rather than clinical observation, which naturally reduces the precision of surviving descriptions even when events were well known at the time. There is also the logistical reality of early 11th century governance. The king's court was mobile, and events occurred across shifting royal sites rather than a fixed administrative capital. As a result, even significant developments could pass through multiple locations before being recorded, increasing the likelihood of detail loss at each stage of transmission. What began as a lived, observable event could become, through successive copying and summarization, a brief and generalized entry. At the same time, the proximity between Edmund's death and the consolidation of power under Canute has encouraged later interpretive layering, not necessarily as evidence of conspiracy, but as a reflection of how historical writing tends to compress causally adjacent events into narrative significance. When a political transition is immediate, the human events surrounding it often become symbolically absorbed into the transition itself. The burial of Edmund at Glastonbury Abbey adds another dimension of closure without clarification. Monastic burial practices were designed to preserve spiritual memory and royal dignity, not to document physiological cause of death. The ritual record confirms status and sanctity, but not the granular reality of the final illness or its progression. From a medical historical perspective, the absence of detail is also consistent with the limitations of early medieval diagnostics. Conditions that are now distinguishable, infectious disease, organ failure, trauma-related complications, would have been grouped under broad categories of sudden illness or bodily collapse. In that sense, the vagueness in the record may reflect not omission, but the conceptual limits of the time. Yet even this practical explanation does not fully resolve why Edmund's death feels unusually compressed in surviving narrative traditions. Compared to other royal deaths of the period, the scarcity of descriptive expansion stands out, suggesting that what was preserved was shaped less by what was known than by what later compilers considered relevant to political continuity. In the end, the uncertainty surrounding Edmund Ironside's death may not rest on a single missing detail, but on the cumulative effect of selective preservation, retrospective writing, and political transition. The moment of his passing lies at the intersection of lived experience and rewritten history, where the urgency of succession overtook the patience of documentation. And so the question persists, not as a claim about hidden events, but as a reflection of historical limits themselves. How much of a ruler's final moments can survive when the system recording them is already turning its attention to what comes next? After the uncertain passing of Edmund Ironside, where political order shifted almost as quickly as the record of his death fades into silence, the narrative moves once again away from royal courts and contested thrones. The weight of power gives way to something quieter, more enclosed, less concerned with kings and battles, and more with silence itself. In the heart of what is now Ireland, there is a lake that seems to hold its own atmosphere. Lough lies surrounded by wooded islands and gently rising hills. Mist often gathers above its surface in the early hours, not rushing away but lingering as though reluctant to leave. The water reflects the sky in fractured tones of gray and silver, broken only by the silhouettes of trees and the slow movement of birds across the horizon. It is a landscape that feels still, but never empty. And it is here, according to medieval tradition, that a group of monks once lived in isolation, before they vanished. Not in a single documented catastrophe, not in a recorded raid or known disaster, but in a disappearance so complete that it survives today more as memory than as verifiable event. The monks of Lough are not well attested in surviving monastic records in the same way as larger Irish ecclesiastical centers such as Clonmacnoise or Kells. Instead, their story is preserved in fragments, local tradition, later medieval references, and oral accounts passed through generations in the surrounding region. According to these traditions, a small monastic community once established itself on one of the lake's islands, seeking the kind of isolation that early Irish monasticism often embraced. In early medieval Ireland, such communities were not uncommon. Monks frequently withdrew from populated areas, building small religious settlements on remote islands, coastal peninsulas, or forested clearings. The purpose was withdrawal from worldly distraction, a life structured around prayer, manuscript copying, and strict communal discipline. In this context, Lough would have offered an ideal setting: water on all sides, limited access, natural isolation, a place where silence is not absence, but presence. Yet what distinguishes this particular story is not the founding of the monastic settlement, but its end. At some point, no precise date is preserved, the monks are said to have disappeared, not relocated, not formally dissolved, not absorbed into another abbey with documented continuity, but vanished. The accounts differ in detail, as oral traditions often do. Some versions suggest that the monks left the island suddenly, abandoning their structures without explanation. Others imply that they were last seen during a period of political unrest in the surrounding region, when shifting territorial control and localized conflict were not uncommon in medieval Ireland. But there are also versions that resist practical explanation entirely. Stories that suggest the monks did not leave at all, that they were still there until they were not. Archaeologically, evidence of monastic presence in the Lough region is limited and fragmented. Earthworks and island structures have been identified, but attribution to a specific monastic community remains uncertain. Unlike more extensively documented monastic sites such as Clonmacnoise, where written records and physical remains reinforce one another, Lough exists in a more ambiguous space between material trace and historical suggestion. This ambiguity opens the door to interpretation. One of the most grounded explanations is also the simplest: gradual abandonment. Monastic communities in medieval Ireland were vulnerable to a range of pressures: resource limitations, regional conflict, changing patronage, or broader ecclesiastical reforms. A small isolated group could slowly diminish in number, relocate for safety or sustainability, or merge with a larger institution. Over time, such a transition might leave little or no distinct record, especially if not formally chronicled. In this reading, there is no sudden disappearance, only quiet dispersal. But the tradition of Lough does not always describe gradual decline. Some accounts emphasize abruptness, a community present and then absent, structures left intact, daily life interrupted without recorded cause. And it is this sense of interruption that has continued to draw attention across centuries of retelling. What could cause a monastic community, already defined by withdrawal and isolation, to vanish in a way that left so little explanatory trace? Medieval Ireland was not free from instability. Regional conflicts between kingdoms, shifting alliances, and localized raids were part of the historical landscape. Monastic sites were sometimes targeted for their resources, manuscripts, or symbolic significance. It is not implausible that a small community on an island could have been affected by such events. Yet even in known cases of monastic disruption elsewhere, traces tend to remain: records of destruction, later rebuilding, or integration into surviving institutions. At Lough such continuity is unclear. There is also the environmental dimension. Islands and lakes are not static environments. Water levels shift over time. Shorelines erode. Wooden structures decay quickly without maintenance. A monastic site that was once accessible and functional could, over decades or centuries, become physically altered or submerged in ways that obscure its original layout. What appears as disappearance may, in part, be transformation beyond easy recognition. Still, even environmental change does not fully account for the absence of consistent historical documentation, which brings the story into a more uncertain territory, where explanation becomes less about evidence and more about interpretation. Some later folkloric accounts introduce more unusual elements. In certain retellings, the monks of Lough are described as having withdrawn not only from society, but from visibility itself, vanishing under circumstances that defy ordinary explanation. These versions are not part of formal ecclesiastical record, but they persist in oral storytelling traditions, where boundaries between history and symbolism are often fluid. In such narratives, the lake itself becomes more than geography. It becomes a threshold, a place where disappearance is not necessarily an event, but a condition. This interpretive layer does not require literal acceptance to be historically significant. It reflects how communities process uncertainty, how gaps in record become shaped into meaning when certainty is unavailable. Another speculative interpretation considers the possibility of deliberate erasure, not in a conspiratorial sense, but in the context of institutional consolidation. As monastic orders in Ireland evolved over time, smaller or isolated communities may have been absorbed into larger structures, their independent identities gradually lost in administrative reorganization. Records could have been transferred, simplified, or never fully preserved in the first place. In such a scenario, the monks did not vanish physically, but disappeared from the specificity of historical memory. They became part of something larger, and in doing so, lost their distinct narrative footprint. Yet even this explanation leaves something unresolved. Because the story of Lough does not survive as a clear administrative transition, it survives as absence. And absence, unlike destruction or relocation, resists closure. There is also a psychological dimension to consider, the way isolation itself shapes perception. A small monastic community living on an island would have experienced time differently from larger settlements. Days structured around ritual, silence, and repetitive labor could create a sense of continuity that, when interrupted, feels abrupt, even if the underlying process was gradual. To outsiders, such a transition might appear as disappearance. To those within, it may have felt like something far more subtle, an unfolding change too slow to record, but too complete to ignore. And yet, the question remains, why does this particular site endure in memory when so many similar monastic settlements existed across medieval Ireland? What makes the monks of Lough distinct in the landscape of historical tradition? Perhaps it is precisely the lack of resolution. Unlike other sites where continuity is traceable, Lough offers no definitive ending point, no clear destruction layer, no documented abandonment decree, no surviving manuscript that anchors the final years of the community. Just water, island, and silence. Modern archaeological surveys of the region continue to refine understanding of settlement patterns, but the specific identification of a monastic disappearance event remains unconfirmed. The physical landscape holds traces of human activity, yet the narrative cohesion expected from historical record is absent. One way to extend the uncertainty around Lough is to situate it within the broader structure of early medieval Irish monastic geography, where isolation was not exceptional but intentionally cultivated. Across regions such as Ireland, monastic communities frequently chose marginal landscapes, lakes, islands, marsh edges, not only for spiritual withdrawal but also for protection and autonomy. In that sense, Lough does not stand apart. It reflects a wider pattern in which geography itself became part of religious practice. This makes the question of disappearance more complex, because monastic vanishing in such contexts often results from long-term institutional absorption rather than sudden rupture. Smaller foundations could gradually come under the influence of larger ecclesiastical centers, especially as reform movements reshaped Irish religious life. Over time, their independent identity could dissolve without a single moment of documented closure, leaving only faint archaeological traces. At the same time, the environmental history of lake systems, such as Lough adds another layer of instability. Water levels fluctuate over centuries, shorelines shift, and wooded islands can expand or contract depending on climate conditions and land use. A settlement once positioned at a navigable edge could become isolated, submerged, or physically inaccessible, effectively erasing its functional footprint even if fragments remain. This environmental mutability intersects with the fragility of medieval record-keeping. Unlike major ecclesiastical centers such as Clonmacnoise, smaller island communities often produced fewer written records, and what they did produce was less likely to survive subsequent centuries of political and religious change. Manuscripts could be relocated, repurposed, or simply lost during periods of instability, creating an archival silence that mirrors physical disappearance. Yet the persistence of the Lough tradition suggests that memory does not depend solely on documentation. Oral transmission in rural communities can preserve the outline of an event long after its material context has vanished. In such cases, what survives is not a precise chronology but a narrative impression, a sense that something once existed in a place that now appears empty. This opens the possibility that disappearance is itself a narrative compression. Multiple slow processes, decline in population, environmental change, institutional absorption, and loss of records, can converge into a single remembered moment of absence. What appears as a sudden vanishing may, in fact, be the final perceptible stage of gradual transformation. There is also the symbolic dimension of monastic withdrawal to consider. Early Irish monasticism often framed isolation as a spiritual ideal, where separation from society was understood as a form of proximity to the divine. In such a worldview, the boundary between physical retreat and metaphysical disappearance can become conceptually blurred in later retellings, especially when transmitted through centuries of reinterpretation. From this perspective, the monks of Lough may function less as a historically discrete group and more as a recurring narrative form, one that expresses the tension between presence and withdrawal in monastic life. Their vanishing becomes a way of articulating the fragility of human presence in landscapes that remain largely unchanged. Ultimately, the story resists closure because it sits at the intersection of three unstable systems: environment, memory, and documentation. Each is capable of erasing detail independently, but together they produce a space where absence feels complete, even when its causes are multiple and gradual. And so Lough remains less a puzzle awaiting resolution than a case study in how places become quiet in history, not through a single moment of disappearance, but through the slow thinning of everything that once made them visible. After the quiet stillness of Lough, where water and memory seem to blur into the same reflective surface, the narrative shifts once again, this time away from monastic isolation and into the dense, uneasy world of royal authority, political instability, and the fragile symbols that were meant to hold a kingdom together. In the early 13th century, the idea of kingship in England was not only enforced by armies or law, it was also embodied in objects. Among them, none carried more weight, both literal and symbolic, than the crown jewels. They represented continuity, legitimacy, and the visible presence of authority in a world where rulers often came and went through conflict rather than succession alone. And yet, in one of the most turbulent reigns of medieval England, those symbols themselves seem to have slipped into uncertainty. The figure at the center of this mystery is King John of England, whose reign from 1199 to 1216 was marked by political conflict, military failure, and growing tension with the English nobility. His rule is often associated with the loss of territories in continental Europe and the increasing strain that would eventually lead to the sealing of the Magna Carta in 1215. But within this broader historical framework lies a more focused and persistent question. What happened to the crown jewels during his reign? Unlike later periods where regalia is carefully documented, catalogued, and preserved. The record surrounding King John's crown and associated royal treasures is fragmented. There are references to royal jewels, ceremonial objects, and regalia held within the treasury, but no definitive, continuous inventory that allows historians to trace every item with certainty. And somewhere within that gap, the mystery takes shape. To understand it, one must first imagine the environment in which these objects existed. Royal treasure in the medieval period was not stored in a single secure vault in the modern sense. Instead, it moved. It traveled with the court, was distributed across castles, and was sometimes pledged as security for loans or political agreements. The royal itinerary was fluid, shifting between locations such as Windsor Castle, Tower of London, and other fortified residences across the kingdom. Each site held portions of royal wealth at different times, depending on political necessity and logistical convenience. This mobility, while practical in a medieval context, also created vulnerability. Because objects of immense symbolic importance were never entirely fixed in one place. Among these were items associated with coronation and royal ceremony, crowns, scepters, rings, and other regalia that marked the transition of power. These were not merely decorative. They were physical manifestations of legitimacy, used in rituals that connected kingship to divine authority and legal continuity. During King John's reign, records indicate that royal finances were under significant strain. Military campaigns required substantial funding. Loss of territories reduced income from continental holdings, and tensions with the nobility increased reliance on taxation, loans, and the pledging of royal assets. In such conditions, it is not difficult to imagine royal treasures being used in ways that extended beyond ceremonial function. Items of value could be pledged as collateral, melted down, altered, or redistributed to meet immediate political and financial needs. And yet, despite these pressures, the crown jewels themselves do not appear in the historical record as explicitly destroyed or formally lost during John's lifetime. Instead, they begin to fade from detailed mention. This absence raises a question that historians have returned to repeatedly. Was there a single moment of loss, or a gradual dispersal over time? One of the most widely discussed episodes connected to this mystery involves the political turmoil of 1216 during the First Barons' War. As conflict intensified between King John and rebellious barons, control over key fortifications and treasury holdings became unstable. It is during this period that some accounts suggest royal valuables may have been moved between strongholds for protection. Castles such as Nottingham Castle and Corfe Castle played roles in royal strategy, serving as both military positions and storage sites for valuable resources. But movement in times of war carries risk. Convoys can be intercepted. Records can be lost. And in the confusion of shifting allegiances, the chain of custody for valuable objects can become unclear almost immediately. So the question emerges naturally: were the crown jewels ever truly lost, or simply displaced into a system that no longer preserved their traceable identity? The most conservative historical interpretation suggests that the royal regalia was not lost in a dramatic singular event during King John's reign, but rather underwent a series of transitions across successive reigns, particularly during periods of reform and reorganization under later monarchs. In this view, what appears as loss is actually archival discontinuity. Objects were reused, remade, or redefined as new regalia under later kings. Medieval crowns were not always permanent artifacts in the modern sense. They could be altered, refashioned, or replaced depending on political and ceremonial needs. But this explanation, while practical, does not fully resolve the uncertainty surrounding specific references to royal treasures during John's lifetime. Some early accounts describe royal jewels being placed under the control of trusted officials or moved for safekeeping during periods of instability. Yet the exact inventory of what was included in these transfers is not preserved in a complete form. This leaves open the possibility that certain items, perhaps older ceremonial pieces associated with earlier dynasties, may have been separated from the main line of regalia and never reintegrated into later documented collections. And so the idea of lost crown jewels becomes less about a single missing object and more about fragmentation. A scattering of artifacts across time, their continuity broken by war, administration, and reconstruction. There is also the broader political context of King John's reign to consider. His relationship with the nobility was deeply strained, culminating in the events that led to the sealing of the Magna Carta in 1215 at Runnymede. This moment represents a significant shift in the balance of power between monarchy and aristocracy. In such a climate, control over royal symbols would have held heightened importance. The crown was not only a ceremonial object, it was a statement of authority in a period when that authority was actively contested. Could symbolic objects have been deliberately withheld, hidden, or controlled by different factions during this time of tension? There is no definitive evidence to suggest deliberate concealment of the crown jewels during John's reign. However, the instability of the period does allow for the possibility that access to royal regalia was not always centralized or secure. Beyond political explanations, environmental and logistical factors also play a role in the uncertainty. Medieval storage conditions, particularly during wartime, were far from ideal. Fire, theft, and decay were constant risks. Even in well-fortified locations such as the Tower of London, historical records from later periods show that royal treasures required continual oversight and were not immune to loss or damage. Over time, as royal administration became more formalized, inventories improved and documentation became more consistent. But earlier periods, including the reign of King John, sit at the threshold between older, less standardized record-keeping and the more structured systems that would follow. This transitional nature is part of what sustains the mystery. Because what is missing may not be a single identifiable crown or jewel, but the continuity of record that would allow modern historians to reconstruct its full trajectory. Some speculative interpretations suggest that certain elements of early English regalia could have been repurposed or incorporated into later ceremonial objects without clear acknowledgement of their origin. In such a scenario, the lost jewels may still exist in altered form, their identity absorbed into newer creations. Others propose that some items may have been removed from official circulation entirely, perhaps gifted, pledged, or taken during periods of instability, entering private collections or ecclesiastical treasuries where they were no longer tracked as royal property. And then there is the simplest possibility, that some objects were simply lost in transit during a time when movement between castles, courts, and strongholds was frequent and often poorly documented. What remains consistent across all interpretations is the absence of a single definitive account that closes the question. Unlike later royal collections, where continuity becomes more traceable, the period surrounding King John exists in a space where documentation is partial, fragmented, and sometimes contradictory. And so the crown jewels, symbols meant to represent stability, become part of a narrative defined by instability. Standing in imagination within the stone walls of Windsor Castle or the fortified towers of Nottingham Castle, one might picture rooms filled with chests, guarded passages, and sealed chambers where royal objects were stored, moved, and accounted for under pressure. But between those images and the surviving records, there is a gap. One way to deepen this uncertainty is to consider how medieval kingship itself treated material regalia, not as fixed heritage, but as reusable political capital. In the administrative world of early 13th century London, royal objects were often recorded in treasury rolls that prioritized value over identity. A crown was not always the same crown in the modern sense. It could be dismantled, its gems removed, its gold melted, and its symbolic meaning reattached to a new object without any surviving record of the transformation. This becomes especially relevant when viewed through the financial machinery of the reign of King John of England. Royal administration at the time relied heavily on pledging assets to sustain military campaigns and political leverage, particularly during conflicts that culminated in the First Barons' War. In such a system, the boundary between treasure, security, and currency was deliberately flexible, allowing regalia to circulate through different forms of use without stable archival anchoring. Another complicating factor is the institutional evolution of storage sites like the Tower of London. Although later known as a central repository for regalia, its earlier medieval function was less systematized than modern assumptions suggest. Treasures were not always deposited, catalogued, and sealed in a continuous chain of custody. Instead, they moved in response to immediate political needs, often under conditions of urgency where documentation lagged behind action. At the same time, the culture of record-keeping in this period was undergoing gradual transformation. The emergence of more structured financial documentation under the English crown was still in progress, meaning that earlier reigns occupy a transitional zone between oral accounted authority and written bureaucratic continuity. What survives from this period is therefore uneven, detailed in some fiscal areas, but surprisingly opaque when it comes to physical regalia. This unevenness opens a structural explanation for the apparent disappearance of the crown jewels. Not loss in a single event, but a progressive thinning of traceable references as objects moved through different institutional contexts. A jewel recorded in one treasury entry might reappear later only as part of a bulk valuation, stripped of identifying detail, effectively dissolving its individuality within accounting language. Environmental and logistical realities reinforce this process. Castles such as those controlled during John's reign were not static archives but active military and administrative centers. Fire risk, siege pressure, and rapid relocation of goods during conflict meant that even highly valuable objects could be repeatedly moved without comprehensive documentation. Each transfer increased the likelihood that continuity of identity would be lost, even if the object itself survived. There is also the question of reinterpretation across successive reigns. Under later monarchs, such as those following the establishment of more formalized financial oversight, earlier regalia may have been absorbed into newly defined collections. In such cases, continuity is preserved materially but erased conceptually. Older objects become indistinguishable from later creations once refashioned, resized, or remounted. Within this framework, the missing crown jewels begin to resemble a problem of classification rather than disappearance. The issue is not simply where the objects went, but whether the administrative language of the time ever allowed them to remain consistently identifiable as the same entities across decades of political change. Finally, there is a conceptual layer that historians often emphasize: the symbolic instability of kingship during crises such as those leading up to the Magna Carta. When authority itself is contested, its symbols become more mobile, more negotiable, and paradoxically less securely documented. The crown, as a material object, is therefore entangled with the instability of the political system it represents. Seen from this perspective, the question is no longer only whether the crown jewels were lost, hidden, or repurposed. It becomes whether medieval administration ever treated them as stable objects in the first place, or whether stability is something later historical reconstruction projects backward onto a system that was, by design, far more fluid than it appears. After the uncertainty surrounding the movement of royal treasures in King John's England, objects of authority slipping through castles, records fragmenting under pressure of war and instability, the narrative shifts once again across the Atlantic world of ambition and disappearance. This time, the focus is not a crown, nor a monastery, nor a vanished king, but a place that exists at the edge of colonial imagination itself. A settlement said to have been built in hope, and later remembered only in questions. To approach it, one must first picture a coastline that seems to stretch endlessly under a heavy sky. The air is humid, dense with salt and vegetation. Rivers widen as they meet the sea, forming estuaries that blur the boundary between land and water. Forests press inward from the edges, thick and unfamiliar to European eyes of the time. Birds call across wide marshes. The horizon is never fully still. In this environment, somewhere along the northern edge of South America, according to fragmentary colonial references, appears the name New Potosi. Not always consistently placed on maps, not always described in the same terms, but repeatedly associated with the idea of a settlement shaped by extraordinary mineral wealth, modeled in name after the famous silver city of Potosi in the Andes. And that association alone already tells us something important, because Potosi itself was one of the most significant mining centers in the early modern world, its wealth drawn from the Cerro Rico mountain and its vast silver deposits. It became a symbol of extraction, empire, and the immense economic forces shaping colonial expansion in South America. So when references emerge, often indirect, often second-hand, to a New Potosi, they carry immediate weight. They suggest replication, expansion, a second center of wealth, perhaps even greater than the original. But unlike its Andean counterpart, New Potosi never stabilizes into clear historical form. It appears in fragments, in exploratory reports that mention inland regions with promising resources, in colonial speculation about undiscovered mineral deposits, in scattered references that hint at settlements or mining ventures that were never fully documented or sustained. And then, just as quickly, it begins to fade from the record. What exactly was New Potosi? Mainstream historical interpretation tends to approach it cautiously. Rather than a confirmed, continuously inhabited colony, New Potosi is often treated as a conceptual or aspirational designation, an early colonial projection of wealth onto unexplored territory. In this view, it represents not a functioning settlement, but an expectation, a name given in anticipation of resources that had not yet been verified. European colonial expansion in the 16th and 17th centuries was often driven by such expectations. Reports of mineral wealth could travel faster than verification. Rumors of silver or gold deposits could lead to expeditions that sometimes found little more than difficult terrain, complex ecological systems, and established indigenous communities with their own intricate economies. In this context, New Potosi may have been less a fixed location and more a moving target, an idea that shifted as explorers advanced further into the continent. But there are aspects of the narrative that resist simple classification. Some colonial accounts, particularly those filtered through later summaries or administrative records, suggest the existence of organized settlement activity in regions associated with the name. These references are inconsistent, but they imply attempts at extraction or colonization that may not have been fully recorded in surviving documentation. If such efforts existed, they may have been short-lived. And here the mystery deepens, because unlike major colonial centers that developed continuous administrative histories, New Potosi leaves behind no clearly identifiable ruins, no confirmed settlement patterns, and no sustained archival trail that connects it definitively to a single location. So what happened to it? One of the most widely accepted explanations is failure of settlement. Early colonial ventures into unfamiliar terrain were often fragile. Logistics were difficult. Supply chains were unreliable. Disease, environmental challenges, and resistance from local populations could all contribute to rapid abandonment of sites that had been initially promising. In this reading, New Potosi may represent one or several attempted settlements that never reached long-term viability. The name could have been reused across different exploratory efforts, applied loosely to regions perceived as potentially rich in minerals. Over time, these attempts could have been absorbed into broader colonial narratives, their specific identities lost in administrative consolidation. But even this explanation leaves gaps. Because historical references to New Potosi often carry a sense of specificity that suggests more than pure speculation. There are indications of mapped routes, proposed mining operations, and geographic markers that were meaningful enough at the time to be recorded, even if inconsistently. This raises another possibility, that New Potosi existed briefly as a functional but unstable colonial outpost, one that was abandoned before it could establish a lasting institutional footprint. In such a scenario, disappearance is not sudden, but structural. A settlement that never fully transitions into permanence leaves behind limited archaeological and documentary traces. And in environments such as the tropical and subtropical regions of northern South America, physical traces can degrade rapidly. Wooden structures decay. Vegetation reclaims cleared land. River systems shift course over decades or centuries, potentially obscuring former settlement sites entirely. So the absence of evidence becomes less surprising, but not necessarily fully explanatory. There are also more speculative interpretations that emerge from the margins of historical analysis. Some suggest that New Potosi may have been deliberately obscured in later records, either due to failure of colonial ventures or because of shifting political priorities that rendered certain exploratory projects irrelevant or inconvenient to document. In this view, disappearance is not purely physical but administrative, a gradual removal from official memory as attention moved elsewhere. Others propose that the name itself may have been applied to multiple, unrelated sites over time, creating a layered confusion in the historical record. If different expeditions used the same aspirational designation for different regions, then New Potosi would not be a single lost place, but a composite of multiple lost attempts. And in that case, the mystery is not where it went, but what it ever was. Yet even these interpretations struggle to fully account for the emotional persistence of the name in historical curiosity. Unlike purely fictional colonial aspirations, New Potosi continues to surface in discussions of early exploration in ways that suggest it was taken seriously by at least some contemporaries. It occupies a space between documented reality and projected ambition, between map and imagination. And that space is often where historical mysteries endure the longest. To understand why, it helps to return briefly to its namesake, Potosi. The original Potosi was not just a city of wealth, it was a symbol of extraction on a global scale. Silver from its mines circulated through imperial economies, shaping trade networks across oceans. It became, in many ways, a reference point for what colonial expansion sought to replicate elsewhere. So, when explorers or administrators invoked New Potosi, they were invoking more than geography. They were invoking expectation, the possibility of repetition, the belief that such wealth could be found again, elsewhere, perhaps even more easily. But expectation is not evidence, and this distinction is at the heart of the mystery. Because while the original Potosi is well documented, heavily studied, and materially present in historical record, New Potosi remains elusive. No single excavation confirms it. No continuous archive preserves its development. No definitive cartographic consensus anchors it to a specific modern location. Instead, it drifts through historical interpretation like a half-formed outline on an incomplete map. Modern historians tend to approach such cases with caution, emphasizing the importance of distinguishing between exploratory intent and realized settlement. In doing so, New Potosi is often categorized as part of a broader pattern of early colonial naming practices, where aspirational geography played a significant role in shaping exploration narratives. But even within this framework, uncertainty remains. Because somewhere between intention and documentation, something was recorded strongly enough to persist, but not clearly enough to survive intact. And so the question remains suspended. Was New Potosi ever a functioning colony that briefly existed before vanishing into environmental and historical obscurity? Was it a name applied to multiple different places, gradually merging into a single ambiguous reference over time? Or was it, from the very beginning, an idea projected onto unknown land, an imagined extension of wealth that never fully materialized into physical form? Standing along the river systems and coastal plains that early explorers once traversed, it is still possible to imagine the process of naming unfolding in real time. A landscape surveyed, a possibility suggested, a designation written down in anticipation of confirmation that may never have fully arrived. And somewhere within that process, New Potosi appears, not fully defined, not fully absent. One way to extend this inquiry is to focus less on the existence of New Potosi as a fixed site, and more on the mechanics of how colonial space itself was produced through writing. In early modern administration, places across the Atlantic world were often created twice, first through exploration and then through inscription in reports, letters, and maps produced in metropolitan centers such as Madrid. In this sense, a settlement could exist vividly in bureaucratic imagination long before, or even without, any stable material counterpart on the ground. This process is especially visible when considering how imperial powers, such as Spanish Empire, managed information from distant territories. Reports from explorers, governors, and merchants did not flow into a single unified archive but into overlapping institutions, each with its own priorities. As a result, names like New Potosi could persist in documentation even when the underlying reality was uncertain, partial, or rapidly changing. Within this system, cartography becomes a crucial intermediary. Maps were not neutral reflections of geography, but instruments of projection and control. A single annotated chart could stabilize a rumor into a location, especially when repeated across different versions. Over time, such cartographic repetition could give the impression of continuity where only fragmented reports had originally existed. Yet the instability of these representations becomes clearer when placed against the environmental realities of northern South America. River systems shift, coastlines erode, and tropical ecosystems rapidly reclaim human alterations. Even a short-lived mining camp or trading post could disappear physically within decades, leaving behind no obvious archaeological signature unless deliberately excavated. This environmental volatility complicates the distinction between lost settlement and never fully established settlement. A site that functioned for only a few seasons might still generate enough administrative paperwork to enter imperial memory, especially if expectations of wealth were high. In such cases, documentation can outlast material presence, producing the paradox of a place that survives in archives but not in landscape. Another factor is the uneven reliability of information chains between colonial peripheries and European centers. Communication delays, transcription errors, and translation across languages, Spanish, Portuguese, indigenous languages, and later administrative Latinizations, could all distort geographic references. A single misunderstood toponym might be replicated across multiple documents, gradually solidifying into the appearance of a coherent settlement like New Potosi. At the same time, the logic of extraction economies encouraged repetition of promising names. Just as the original Potosi became a global symbol of mineral abundance, its name could be rhetorically extended to other sites to signal comparable potential. New Potosi may therefore function less as a unique designation and more as a transferable label of expectation, attached wherever similar hopes briefly emerged. This helps explain why the name resists final localization. Instead of pointing to a single coordinate, It may index a series of exploratory moments scattered across time and space, each briefly intensified by speculation, each fading once results failed to match projections. The disappearance is then not a single event, but a repeated cycle of anticipation and abandonment. From this perspective, the absence of ruins is not necessarily an anomaly, but an expected outcome. Many early extraction sites were designed for rapid exploitation rather than permanence. If resources proved insufficient or difficult to access, structures were dismantled, relocated, or simply left to decay. In such conditions, the archaeological footprint can be minimal from the outset. Still, the persistence of New Potosi in historical discussion suggests that something more than administrative noise is at work. Certain names acquire narrative gravity even when their material grounding is weak. They become organizing points for later interpretation, drawing together scattered references into a single conceptual object that feels more stable than the sources that produced it. Ultimately, New Potosi may be best understood not as a place waiting to be rediscovered, but as a byproduct of how early colonial systems converted uncertainty into language. It occupies the space where geography, ambition, and documentation briefly align, and then drift apart again, leaving only a trace of what was once confidently expected to exist. After the fading uncertainty of New Potosi, where entire settlements seemed to dissolve between ambition and record, the narrative turns back toward Europe, where history becomes less about lost places and more about lost documentation itself. Because sometimes, what disappears is not a city, a colony, or a crown, but the written account of judgment. And few cases illustrate this more hauntingly than the trial of Gilles de Rais. To approach it properly, one must first imagine the setting: 15th century Western France, where stone fortresses still dominate the landscape, and political authority is deeply intertwined with feudal power and the lingering structures of the 100 Years' War. Forests are dense and difficult to traverse. Roads are uneven, connecting villages that often exist in semi-isolation. Justice is not centralized in the modern sense, but administered through overlapping systems of church authority, noble jurisdiction, and royal intervention. In this world, trials are not only legal proceedings, they are performances of authority. And in 1440, one such trial would become infamous. Gilles de Rais, once a Marshal of France, companion in arms to Joan of Arc during campaigns of the 100 Years' War, was arrested and accused of a series of crimes that would later be interpreted through both historical and legendary frameworks. He was charged with heresy, occult practices, and the murder of numerous children. The proceedings took place primarily in and around the ecclesiastical jurisdiction of Nantes, under the authority of both secular and church courts. What survives of the trial today comes from partial transcripts, later summaries, and documents preserved in ecclesiastical and judicial archives. But here is where the mystery begins to take shape. Because the records we possess are not complete, they are fragmented, reconstructed, and in some cases, transmitted through copies rather than original documentation. Large portions of the original court records, interrogations, witness testimonies, procedural documents, are either missing, incomplete, or known only through references in later sources. So the question emerges naturally: what happened to the missing records of Gilles de Rais' trial? The mainstream historical explanation begins with the realities of medieval documentation. Court records in the 15th century were not preserved with the consistency of modern legal systems. Documents were handwritten on parchment, stored in church archives, and vulnerable to fire, dampness, war, and administrative neglect. Over centuries, many such records were lost simply through deterioration or relocation. In this view, the missing portions of the trial are not unusual. They are part of a broader pattern of archival survival bias, where only fragments of medieval legal processes remain intact. But the case of Gilles de Rais is unusual in another sense. The parts that do survive are extensive enough to suggest that a much larger body of documentation once existed. The transcripts we have include detailed confessions, interrogations, and procedural exchanges. They are too structured, too systematic, to represent the entirety of the original proceedings. This implies that what survives is not the complete archive, but a curated or partial selection. Why only these sections, and not others? Some historians suggest that portions of the records may have been intentionally summarized rather than fully copied during archival transmission. Medieval scribes often condensed legal material, preserving essential judgments and confessions while omitting procedural repetition or extended questioning. If this occurred here, it would naturally reduce the volume of surviving material without implying deliberate concealment. Yet even this explanation does not fully account for the scale of absence. Because references within the surviving documents imply a broader investigative process, multiple interrogations, extended witness testimonies, and ecclesiastical deliberations that are not fully preserved in extant manuscripts. This raises the possibility that the missing records were once housed in centralized ecclesiastical archives that have since been dispersed or lost. One likely candidate for initial storage would have been the ecclesiastical administration in and around Nantes, where the trial was conducted. Over time, such records could have been transferred to regional or royal archives, especially as legal authority shifted between church and crown. But archival movement introduces risk. Every transfer increases the chance of separation, miscataloguing, or loss. And over the centuries following the trial, France underwent periods of significant upheaval, religious conflict, political restructuring, and revolution, all of which affected archival preservation. In particular, the French Revolution led to widespread redistribution and destruction of ecclesiastical documents across the country. Many monastic and church archives were seized, reorganized, or destroyed during this period. It is within such transitions that medieval legal records were often fragmented beyond reconstruction. So one mainstream possibility is that the missing parts of the trial were lost gradually through centuries of archival instability. But there is another dimension to the mystery that goes beyond simple loss. Because even in surviving accounts, there are signs of editorial shaping. The narrative structure of the trial records emphasizes confession. It moves through accusations toward admission in a way that feels procedurally coherent. Yet historians have long noted that medieval legal confessions, particularly in ecclesiastical courts, were often shaped by interrogation methods, translation between Latin and vernacular languages, and the legal expectations of the period. This raises interpretive questions rather than factual ones. What was said in the moments that are not recorded? How were answers framed, translated, or summarized before being written down? And how much of the original dialogue between interrogators and accused survives in recognizable form? Some scholars suggest that the surviving documents may represent a legal finalization of the trial rather than a full transcript of its proceedings. In other words, what remains may be closer to a judicial summary than a complete stenographic record. If that is the case, then the missing records are not simply lost. They were never fully preserved in the first place. Yet the gaps still feel significant enough to invite further speculation. In more interpretive or fringe perspectives, the missing documentation has sometimes been associated with the idea of narrative control. The trial of Gilles de Rais was conducted in a context where both ecclesiastical authority and secular power were deeply concerned with maintaining moral and political order. A case involving a high-ranking nobleman accused of heresy and extreme crimes would have carried immense symbolic weight. In such a context, the shaping of the official record becomes not only a matter of documentation, but of authority. Which details are preserved becomes as important as which are omitted. However, there is no definitive evidence that records were deliberately destroyed or suppressed in a coordinated way. The more cautious historical interpretation emphasizes loss through time rather than intentional erasure. Still, the uneven survival of documentation leaves room for interpretive uncertainty, because what we know of the trial is filtered through what remains, and what remains is incomplete. There is also the question of language. The trial was conducted in a multilingual environment where Latin served as the legal and ecclesiastical standard, while vernacular French was likely used in spoken testimony. Translation between these layers introduces further complexity. Subtle shifts in meaning could occur at each stage of transcription. What was originally spoken may not align perfectly with what was recorded, and what was recorded may not align perfectly with what survives. This layering effect creates a kind of documentary distance between the event itself and its modern understanding. So, when we speak of missing court records, we are not only referring to physical absence, but to a widening gap between event and preservation. The physical documents that once existed in chambers of ecclesiastical authority, perhaps within or near Nantes, have either fragmented, dispersed, or been absorbed into partial collections that no longer reflect their original completeness. And yet, despite this fragmentation, the trial remains one of the most documented of its era, which itself is revealing, because even partial survival suggests that at some point there was a deliberate effort to preserve at least parts of the proceedings. The question is not only what was lost, but what was deemed important enough to keep. Confession records, procedural summaries, legal conclusions. These remain. But the full texture of the trial, the extended exchanges, the procedural context, the full range of testimony, exists only in outline, and outlines invite reconstruction. Modern historians continue to examine the surviving manuscripts, comparing versions, tracing inconsistencies, and attempting to reconstruct the structure of the original proceedings. But the missing portions remain out of reach, not because they are entirely unknown, but because they exist only as absence within the surviving framework. And absence, in historical terms, is rarely neutral. It shapes interpretation as much as presence does. So the mystery of the missing court records of Gilles de Rais is not simply about lost parchment or damaged archives. It is about the boundaries of what history chooses or is able to preserve. One way to push this question further is to return to the physicality of medieval record-keeping itself. In 15th century France, legal documentation was not a static archive, but a living administrative tool, constantly being rewritten, recopied, and reorganized. In cities like Nantes, ecclesiastical scribes worked under practical constraints, limited parchment, variable storage conditions, and shifting institutional priorities. What survived was often what remained useful, not what was most complete. This means that the trial of Gilles de Rais must also be understood through the administrative logic of its time. The proceedings did not occur in isolation, but within the broader legal and religious frameworks of late medieval France. Records could be abbreviated, repurposed, or even rewritten to serve later institutional needs, especially when cases carried moral or doctrinal significance. At the same time, the wider instability of the period shaped what could realistically be preserved. The aftermath of the 100 Years' War left regions of Western France politically and economically strained. Administrative centers were frequently reorganized, and archives were not always treated as permanent repositories, but as movable collections subject to the disruptions of war, reform, and relocation. Within this environment, the idea of a single, intact trial archive becomes increasingly unlikely. Instead, what likely existed was a distributed set of documents, interrogations stored in one ecclesiastical office, procedural notes in another, and final judgments preserved separately as legal proof. Over time, this fragmentation would naturally produce the kind of partial survival we observe today. Yet fragmentation alone does not fully explain the specific shape of what remains. The surviving records of the trial show a level of narrative coherence that suggests selection. They move in structured progression from accusation to confession, as if guided by an underlying editorial hand. This raises the possibility that later copyists, rather than preserving the full procedural complexity, chose to transmit only the segments they considered legally or theologically essential. Such editorial filtering was not unusual in medieval manuscript culture. Scribes often worked less as neutral transcribers and more as interpreters of authoritative meaning. In the case of a figure as politically and morally charged as Gilles de Rais, this tendency could have been even stronger, prioritizing clarity of judgment over the preservation of every procedural exchange. Another layer of uncertainty comes from the material transitions of archives across centuries. Ecclesiastical documents were frequently moved between institutions, especially during periods of reform or centralization. Each transfer introduced the possibility of misplacement or partial loss. Bundles of records could be split, mislabeled, or incorporated into unrelated collections without clear cataloging systems. Even when such materials survived intact into later centuries, they were not immune to more abrupt disruptions. The revolutionary reorganization of church property and archives in French Revolution led to widespread displacement of ecclesiastical records across the country. In this process, countless medieval documents were either destroyed, scattered, or absorbed into state holdings without comprehensive indexing. However, the persistence of partial transcripts suggests that some effort at preservation did exist. The very fact that interrogation sequences and confessional structures remain indicates that at least one archival tradition recognized their legal or moral importance. What is missing, then, is not total silence, but uneven survival, fragments that point toward a once larger, now inaccessible whole. This unevenness also affects interpretation itself. Modern readings of the trial are built on reconstructed sequences, where gaps are filled not with recovered data, but with inferred continuity. Each missing section subtly shifts the perceived meaning of what remains, allowing the surviving record to appear more linear and decisive than the original proceedings may have been. Ultimately, the case of Gilles de Rais becomes less about a single lost archive and more about the inherent instability of historical transmission. What we call the trial today is not a complete object recovered from the past, but a layered construction assembled from remnants, copies, and institutional memory. And in that sense, the missing records are not an exception. They are the normal condition of medieval history itself.